Welcome to Spirit Knocks for Brooklyn Mosaic. So in the last video, we were talking about location, right? And I was telling you all how I realized that I was being led back to New York City. And then I started to do this thing where I was tracing my footsteps like I'm doing. I felt like, you ever watch those movies where they show someone going backwards into the past? This is literally how I felt like I'm doing, except instead of going backwards, I'm coming full circle, right? So I'm going forward because sometimes we have to retrace our steps to really understand our journey. So here's the deal. After I looked at the connection between Gambia and New York, I started to look at all of the places that I've ever lived and visited and worked. And when I tell you, I'm about to blow your mind because this is something you will do and you will realize how everything you've done thus far has led you to where you are in your journey now. So check this out. Like I said, I was raised in Brooklyn, New York, right? Brooklyn, New York was one of the biggest slaveholding areas. Kings County, Brooklyn. Kings County was a big area for kidnapped Africans. I didn't know that, y'all. Not at that time. Then I looked at where I went to college. I went to college in Tarrytown, New York, which is right next to Sleepy Hollow, which is where Phillipsburg Manor is. Another big, uh, I guess you would call it a plantation. At that time, it was a plantation, right? Where Africans were held, where slaves were kept, kidnapped Africans were kept at Phillipsburg Manor. Then I looked at um, New York itself being one of the biggest slave-holding states in the North. I didn't know that. I had no idea because really what we're talking about is from people running from the fields to the factories in New York, but it was still slavery, except maybe it looked different because instead of being in the field, you was being kept in someone's house, right? Or you were working in a factory, or you were helping to build an entire city, right? Which was different than what was happening in the South, but really the same. You know how they say same game, different players? It was like that. It was like that. I think people had this impression that the North was going to be so much better because the North knew how to convince people with the media, newspapers, headhunters, right? That's where that whole terminology came from for headhunters, right? Um, Recruiters to bring people from the South for this so-called better living in the North. The trickery that existed in the Matrix at the time, but it got people to come to New York. And unfortunately, many people were able to survive it. Other people recognized it for what it was and were able to take advantage and, be productive. And other people probably ended up going back home or didn't do too well coming up to such a fast-paced environment. Nevertheless, so that was the other thing. I realized that my life has led me to these locations. So we talked about Kings County, Brooklyn. Talked about Sleepy Hollow, Tarrytown, New York. We talked about, so what else did I say? I'm sorry. We talked about, working in places like factories and stuff like that. So I worked in Manhattan, and of course, in Manhattan is the court buildings, which we know many were probably built by the kidnapped Africans or slave population. Um, and then it was Wall Street, right? I worked right around Wall Street. I worked on Chambers Street. I worked at all the courthouses down in Lower Manhattan, right across the Brooklyn Bridge. And we know all of that consisted of, this slave labor. Um, it's just deep when I think back on it. And then I was thinking, Okay, I was born in New York, New York, but Cleopatra's Needle is in Central Park. So now I have to start looking at other things that I need to start checking out because I believe somehow I am connected to all of these things, obviously, and that's why I will be going back and doing research and uncovering and decoding things that were not left obvious for us because now I'm going back with a different vision. I'm going back with a different mentality. Um, I remember a story when I was younger, a neighbor who was one of the few white couples still left on my street in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, on Rutland Road. His name was Mr. Butler. He told me a story about how his mother used to get milk from the dairy farm, which was Wingate High School, and it never occurred to me to ask him who was working on that farm, right? What was the labor like? Because, I was a kid when he was telling me this story. He was just saying, like, he remembered being a kid, growing up in the neighborhood, and how much things had changed. And I was just amazed listening to this story, but I never forgot that story. So it's interesting now that I'll be going back to retrace my steps. Um, it's deep. I even looked at places that I've traveled to, and when I think about the history of our people, indigenous Americans, African Americans, enslaved people, in these places, it kind of blows my mind. So something was like I needed to go to Arizona. I've been to Arizona two times, and then I wanted to go to Vegas. I remember going there for my birthday. I treated myself to Vegas, and I've been to Mexico, but I didn't get to go to the ruins when I went to Mexico. But I did go to Mexico. Um, I used to go to a lot of powwows. I had a friend that was a dancer, and I would go and support her at the powwows. And I realized there's a connection there as well. I really want to get to some of the reservations. Um, I've been to Spain and Germany. I lived in the UK. I've been to Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, Bahamas, Barbados. Um, again, connections in all these places, right? Amsterdam, yep. And I've always wanted to go to parts of Asia. Like I want to go to India and Thailand. There's still a bunch of African countries that I want to visit. I always wanted to go to Mali, and possibly Tanzania, Rwanda. So those are places I haven't been yet, but I've been quite a few places in the States as well. North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, Connecticut, Texas, Missouri, Minneapolis, Ohio, Florida, Georgia, mm, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Yeah, it's quite a few places that I still want to go, but I realize places that I have been is because there's history there. There's history there. I didn't know it at the time, but your spirit has a way of pulling you back to certain places. You have energetic connections to places that you don't realize. So I'm asking you all to do the same. Trace all the places you've been to, trace all the places you want to go, and try to figure out the connections, like connected dots, right? I think you will find it very interesting. I hope you found this helpful to your journey, and we're going to move on to the next one. Blessings.